Picture a boy, maybe 12 years old, sitting at the edge of a Paleolithic camp somewhere in what is now southern France, roughly 20,000 years ago. The other children his age have learned to knap flint into arrowheads with tight, repeatable precision. Their hands move in the same pattern every time. He can't do that. His hands don't cooperate that way. The sequence slips. He reverses steps. He loses his place. The elders watch him, and they don't pull him away from the work. They hand him something different, a piece of ochre and a flat stone, and they point toward the cave. He goes in. What he leaves on that wall is still there. You can visit it. That boy's brain wasn't broken. It was wired for something the camp needed more than another arrowhead napper. For most of human history, people who processed information differently, who struggled with sequential reading, with precise repetition, with left-to-right linear ordering, weren't sorted out. They weren't failures. They were, in documented ways that archaeologists and cognitive scientists have spent decades trying to understand, some of the most valuable minds in any group. The story of dyslexia isn't a story about what went wrong in the brain. It's a story about what the brain was built to do first, and why modern schooling is the first environment in human history that made it look like a problem. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Here's the assumption most people carry into this. Dyslexia is a reading disorder. That framing makes sense on the surface because reading is where it gets diagnosed, in classrooms, in tests, in the moment a child reverses letters and falls behind a peer who doesn't. But reading as humans practice it today, sequential symbols arranged left to right on a flat surface, each one coding for a specific sound, has only existed for roughly 5,000 years. The brain that struggles with it is far older. Modern Homo sapiens have been cognitively modern for at least 300,000 years. The written alphabet arrived in the last 1.7% of that span. Calling dyslexia a reading disorder is like calling a fish a bad climber. The fish wasn't built for the tree. The tree was just built recently. In 2011, cognitive neuroscientist Gadi Geffen and his colleagues at the University of Haifa published research showing that dyslexic readers process visual information fundamentally differently than non-dyslexic readers. Not worse, differently. Where a typical reader anchors on fine sequential detail, a dyslexic reader's visual system is biased toward the big picture, global shape, spatial relationships, patterns across large areas of space. The technical term researchers use is global visual processing bias. The dyslexic brain sees the whole thing first. The parts come later, if at all. That sounds like a limitation until you take it out of a classroom and put it somewhere else. In 2011 at Harvard, researchers Brock and Fernet Eid, a physician and a neuropsychologist, published a framework they called the mind skills, drawn from fMRI studies of dyslexic brains. What the scans showed was consistent and striking. Dyslexic brains showed reliably stronger activity in regions governing 3D spatial reasoning, pattern recognition across incomplete information, mechanical systems thinking, and narrative memory, the kind of memory that encodes events as stories rather than lists. These weren't small differences. They were structural. They showed up across subjects. And every single one of those strengths maps directly onto skills that kept pre-literate humans alive. Think about what tracking an animal actually requires. You're not reading a sequence. You're holding a mental map of terrain, reading a partial pattern of prints and bent grass, constructing a 3D model of an animal's likely movement through space, updating it constantly as new information arrives. A tracker who sees the whole pattern first, who can construct the full picture from fragments, is better at this than a tracker who processes piece by piece. Anthropologist Louis Liebenberg spent years documenting persistence hunters among the San people of the Kalahari in the late 1980s and 1990s. What he found was that the elite trackers in those communities didn't read signs sequentially, they projected it. They constructed a spatial hypothesis and then tested it. The mental process Liebenberg described in his 1990 book The Art of Tracking maps almost precisely onto the global visual processing pattern that fMRI studies later identified in dyslexic brains. The skills that look like deficits in a reading test were assets in the field. For hundreds of thousands of years, they were competitive advantages. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything, and helps me bring you more stories like this one. The cave evidence takes this further. At Lascaux in France, dated to roughly 17,000 years ago, and at Chauvet, older still at around 36,000 years, the paintings show something that modern art analysts have noted with consistent surprise. The animals aren't flat, they're drawn in motion. The legs are staggered in ways that accurately represent a galloping gait. The bodies are rendered with accurate understanding of foreshortening, the way a shape changes when it's moving toward you versus away from you. These paintings demonstrate accurate 3D spatial modeling and motion projection. They weren't decorative. Paleolithic hunters used them. Research by archaeologist Ian Davidson and others has suggested the caves functioned partly as cognitive rehearsal spaces, places where hunters pre-ran scenarios mentally before executing them in the field. The people who made those paintings weren't working from a written instruction set. They were translating a 3D mental model directly onto a surface. That is exactly what strong global spatial processors do well, and exactly what sequential processors find harder. There's a parallel finding in medicine. In 2007, pediatric radiologist Matthew Schneps, himself dyslexic, ran a study at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics examining how dyslexic and non-dyslexic scientists read astronomical images. The task involved scanning X-ray telescope images for anomalies, irregular shapes embedded in complex visual fields. Dyslexic scientists significantly outperformed non-dyslexic scientists on detection of peripheral and irregular anomalies. The same visual system that stumbles on a line of identical letters excels at finding the one thing in a wide field that doesn't belong. In an ancestral environment, scanning a tree line for a predator, reading a landscape for water, spotting an injured animal in a herd, that isn't a small edge. That is survival. None of this means dyslexia is only an asset. The reading difficulty is real. The daily frustration in modern classrooms is real. The gap between a child's understanding and their ability to demonstrate it on paper is real and costly. But the research keeps returning to the same observation. The difficulty and the strength come from the same source. The brain that struggles to hold a sequence of letters is often the same brain that holds a 3D landscape with extraordinary precision. You can't have one without the other. They are the same wiring. In 2017, Helen Taylor at the University of Cambridge published a paper arguing that dyslexia isn't best understood as a disorder at all, but as a specialization, a trade-off that human populations maintained because the strengths it carried were worth the costs in certain contexts. Her argument draws on a simple observation. If dyslexia conferred only disadvantage, selection pressure over hundreds of thousands of years would have reduced it. Dyslexia runs at roughly 15 to 20% of every human population ever studied, across every culture, every geography, every era. That number doesn't persist by accident. A trait that appears in 1 in 5 people across all of human history isn't a malfunction. It's a feature that kept getting passed forward. The camps that sent dyslexic brains into the cave, that kept them close to the fire at night to remember and retell, those camps retained something. A way of seeing that linear thinkers couldn't replicate, a memory for terrain, a recognition of pattern where others saw only noise. What changed wasn't the brain. What changed was the world those brains had to live in. 5,000 years ago, writing appeared. 300 years ago, mass literacy became the aspiration of entire societies. 100 years ago, schools built around reading speed and sequential processing became the primary arena in which children were evaluated. In the entire sweep of human history, that is a very recent test, and it was designed, entirely without meaning to make 15 to 20% of every classroom look like they were failing. They weren't failing, they were sitting in the wrong environment, carrying the right wiring for a world that school had quietly stopped asking them to navigate. The boy in the cave at Lascaux who couldn't sequence a flint knapping procedure perfectly, he painted an aurochs in full gallop on a stone wall 17,000 years ago, and the painting still stops people in their tracks today. His brain held the animal's movement across 3 dimensions in a way that no sequential instruction set could have produced. His camp knew what he was for. They pointed him at the wall. That is not a metaphor for making peace with a deficit. That is an accurate description of what cognitive diversity looked like when the environment was honest about what it needed. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.